Hello readers, I'm the Avid and today I'm reviewing The New Koreans, The Business, History and People of South Korea, written by the British journalist Michael Breen. So Michael Breen is a British journalist who's lived in South Korea since the 80s. So he's been there for over 30 years at least. So he's witnessed South Korea's democratization in 1987-1988. He has met several important Korean people. He's met Kim Il-sung of North Korea. He's met several of the democracy leaders in South Korea like Kim Dae-jung. In other words, he has a lot of first-hand experience in South Korea. And for me, a history student who's fascinated by the country of South Korea, I love K-pop and K-dramas and things like that. And I also find it fascinating the way South Korea democratized, in part through the conviction of the Christianity of Kim Dae-jung. So I found this a very fascinating book. It's structured a bit oddly, so it's not exactly chronological. It doesn't just talk about history, it talks a lot about history, but it also just talks about the business system of South Korea, the hierarchy, and also the culture, religion, norms, things like that. So I'm mainly gonna talk about the history and in a chronological way. Then I'm gonna talk a bit about the culture and some reflections. So Korea has been a united country for a long time. You had a 5-century-long dynasty called the Joseon Dynasty from 1392 until around 1910. And you know, Korea was of course split up in two parts in 1945. But it was united in 1392 under General Yi, also known as King Taejo. And it was run on Neo-Confucian principles, so it was actually more Confucian in how it was run and more hierarchical than what China was at the time. And the most famous king of Korea is King Sejong, who introduced the Hangul writing system. He ruled from 1418 to 1450. The Korean Hangul script is anti-elitist. It's a simplified version of the original Chinese script and it's a lot easier to learn. I know this because I've been trying to learn Korean myself, and while it's not easy, the Hangul writing system, although it's very different from Latin, it's relatively simple. There are a few dozen characters you need to learn instead of the thousands or whatever it is for the Chinese language. But you've had institutionalized Neo-Confucian bureaucracy who during the Joseon Dynasty did its best to prevent any reforms, so they still wrote in Chinese script. And the Joseon era was very hierarchical, and they did have slavery, which gradually was abolished in the 18th and 19th century. And for most of its history, Korea has been under the sphere of influence of China, known as suzerainty, where Korea recognizes the superiority of China. Around the turn of the 20th century, you had a shift from being in the Chinese sphere of influence to the Japanese sphere of influence. You did have the 1895 Sino-Japanese War, I think it was, and this put Korea firmly in the Japanese sphere of influence. And you also had the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 that kind of was connected to Korea. And Korea became more and more under Japan's influence until it was literally annexed in 1910 as a Japanese colony.
Challenge 1910! Japan attack Korea!
And the period when Japan ruled Korea from 1910 to 1945 is detested by Koreans. This is why many Koreans still today despise Japan. And during the period when it was a colony, you still had a lot of Korean nationalists. But Japan actually did kind of modernize Korea a bit. It built some infrastructure, and a lot of institutions of South Korea during the Cold War era and still today are kind of based off of Japanese institutions that came into place with the Meiji Restoration. Especially during the 1920s, Japanese rule in Korea was relatively benign. You have what is known as the cultural era, so then you had quasi-free speech, not exactly, but you had some freedom of the press during the 1920s. And this reflected, of course, that Japan was becoming more and more democratic during the 1920s. So then Korean cultural identity was more allowed to flourish during that period. but then that closed off and got much worse in 1937, I think, because that's when officially the Second Sino-Japanese War starts, and this is when the Japanese imperialists become very militaristic, very authoritarian, very brutal. So you had 80,000 to 200,000 comfort women, basically sex slaves who served at the pleasure of the Japanese military, and most of these sex slaves were Korean actually. And you had several million Koreans, 4 to 7 million, a lot of it forced labor, who were put into the Japanese war machine. Then in 1945, Korea was liberated from Japanese rule and split in two. So you had the Soviet sphere of influence in North Korea and the American sphere of influence in South Korea. Of course, the American sphere of influence is far more benevolent. A communist totalitarian dictatorship was instituted in North Korea under Kim Il-sung, and then in South Korea you had a quasi-autocracy institutionalized under Syngman Rhee, who became the leader of South Korea in 1948 and ruled through relatively fraudulent elections until 1960. So during this period, you did have some free speech, but the bureaucrats ran rampant. The bureaucrats and the police basically did whatever they wanted. So you had massacres of suspected communists in the south. There was also the Korean Civil War, where North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950, and that ended in 1953. You had a lot of leftists who went with the North back, and a lot of people were also kidnapped to North Korea. This created a strong fear of North Korea by South Korea after the United States liberated South Korea during the Korean War. So anyone who's a suspected communist or communist sympathizer or pro-North Korean could be executed or imprisoned. You have this thing in South Korea called the National Security Law. This is still in place today. This is the one place that still today you don't really have free speech in South Korea. You have freedom of expression for the most part in South Korea, except when it comes to being sympathetic to North Korea. So in the same way that it's illegal to be a Nazi in Germany today, it's quasi-illegal to be a communist or North Korean sympathizer in South Korea. But South Korea was very badly run in the 1950s under Syngman Rhee, and he just kept himself in power through fraudulent elections and manipulations, so he screwed up South Korea's potential democracy. And at the time, by the way, in the 1950s, North Korea was technically richer than South Korea. That's how poor South Korea was. And eventually, after a fraudulent election in 1960, South Koreans were fed up, so you had student demonstrations that removed him from power. And then you had a short experiment with democracy that ended in 1961 with the military coup by Park Chung-hee. And he ruled until 1979 and became more and more autocratic over time. But the one really positive thing he did, of course, was begin the process to make South Korea into a rich country through the process of what is known as guided capitalism. So what this meant is that the South Korean government under Park Chung-hee would set targets, and it would issue loans through the state-owned banks to big companies known as these chaebol to work towards these goals. So it was a very export-oriented policy, and that system of economy doubled multiple times South Korea's GDP per capita and wealth over the period of Park Chung-hee's rule. So to give a bit of perspective with these numbers, in 1967, South Korea had a GDP per capita of $150. That's very low. In 1977, South Korea had a per capita GDP of 1,000. That's still low, but nonetheless, in a 10-year period, South Korea's GDP per capita increased sixfold. That's huge. South Korea is one of the only countries in the world, along with, I think, Taiwan, that had consecutive double-digit GDP growth for decades. So it's very impressive, and it actually puts into question the idea of free market economics to a certain extent, because it shows that government maybe can have a role in producing high economic growth. Of course, this is still a mixed market economy system, and if you go to the extreme of North Korea, of course, you cannot achieve this, but maybe a mixed market economic system can lead to high wealth growth. As I said, Park Chung-hee became more and more authoritarian over time. So there was a point where he came very close to losing an election to Kim Dae-jung. So he became far more repressive. And this opposition leader, Kim Dae-jung, who was on the left, but he was not a communist and he was also a strong Christian believer. The South Korean dictatorship was very close several times at killing him. He was imprisoned multiple times. He was kidnapped at least once when he visited Japan once. But the CIA saved his life several times. There's this thing online of, oh, the CIA backed a bunch of coups, which is true, but it also helped future democracy in other countries, like in South Korea. The American government didn't strongly back a dictatorship. South Korea, sure, you had aid being sent there, but they were still trying to keep alive the opposition activists. But eventually, the head of the Korean CIA, it's literally called that, in October 1979 became fed up with Park Chung-hee, who was criticizing him for not killing enough people. So he just went and picked up a gun and shot Park Chung-hee. So he was succeeded as dictator by Chun Do-won, and he promised basically, oh yeah, we're gonna democratize in time for the South Korean Summer Olympics in 1988. But he was still repressive initially, so you had what is known as the Gwangju massacre, where over 100 people were killed by the police, I think, and you had a bunch of protests in the 1980s, and then you had also leftist students doing whatever at university, and you had clashes between the police and demonstrators, oftentimes violent, although not that violent. They used tear gas, but the police still made sure that protesters could escape. They didn't really want to kill too many people because, well, you're getting ready for the Summer Olympics. And the turning point came around June, July 1987. You had a student who was killed through police brutality, and this made everyone furious, and they strongly protested. And then you had Chun Do-won, who promised, okay, we're gonna have fair and free elections now in December 1987. The South Korean state became far less repressive. Then you had his friend who won the December 1987 election and came to power in February 1988, known as Roh Tae-woo. So Roh Tae-woo had helped Chun Do-won come to power. So yeah, it was a relatively free and fair election. There was some violence, and of course there weren't secret ballots on military bases, so it wasn't that fair. But still, the reason that Roh Tae-woo won the South Korean election was because the opposition was split between Kim Yong-san and Kim Dae-jo and someone else. And you had increasing liberalization and democratization under the following leaders of South Korea. So Roh Tae-woo, Kim Yong-nam, who released a bunch of prisoners and prisoners of conscience, especially leftists or North Korea sympathizers. And then Kim Dae-jung, who had strong Christian ethics, so he did some reforms of the South Korean state. And then you had Roh Moo-yoon, who really tried to decrease the power of the presidency, because South Korea had a presidential system, so the president had a lot of power, and the separation of powers in South Korea wasn't that great between the judiciary and legislative branch and the executive. They tried to do those reforms, and South Korea was becoming more liberal democratic over time. But then that slowly began to reverse in 2008 with the coming to power of Lee Myung-bak. So remember, you still have in South Korea the national security law, which makes open discussion of North Korea a bit hard and allows for persecution and abuse by the government. And there's also some laws in the Korean constitution that can be interpreted in a way for political persecution. So something that has happened several times in South Korea is that you have the executive who charged someone with a crime, and then that person is acquitted by the judiciary. But you also have a lot of collusion in South Korea between the chaebol big enterprises and the political leaders. So during a period, Freedom House downgraded South Korea to a semi-free country instead of a free one. Then you had Park Geun-hye, who was corrupt. She had engaged in nepotism and extortion and corruption. So this book, remember, ends in 2017. But soon after this book was written, Park Geun-hye, who is, by the way, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, was removed from power. She was impeached. South Korea has become a bit more free market nowadays, I would say. So after the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the South Korean state let a bunch of the enterprises fall apart, and a lot of short-term loan businesses just collapsed. And the South Korean government reformed its economy after it got an IMF loan. And it paid that loan back, by the way, and then had a budget surplus, which allowed it to handle the 2008 financial crisis relatively well. This is the narrative of the book, by the way. I'm not sure yet how much I agree with the financial and economic analysis of this author. I need to read more before I can make a conclusion on this. And a weird thing in South Korea, by the way, is that the left is actually more free market capitalist than the right, because the Korean right does a lot of collusion with crony capitalists, the chaebol big enterprises. Samsung, for example, has huge influence in South Korea. At one point, 15% of the stock market was just Samsung. I was Googling, by the way, one of the big universities in South Korea yesterday, and then I saw, oh, this was founded by Hyundai, another big Korean company. So South Korea does have some problem with corruption and government collusion with big business, and it's not free market at all. They have several times prevented foreign enterprises to establish themselves, and prosecutors have been selective in enforcing laws, so they enforce them much more on foreigners than on local enterprises. So now would be a good segue to talk about the business and culture of South Korea. South Korea is based mainly on Neo-Confucian culture, so that's hierarchical. So the son is supposed to be loyal to his father, the wife to his husband, the man to his friend. So even though equality of the law is enshrined in South Korea, the norms are slowly evolving towards that. They're not there yet. So one thing that this book talks about in Korean businesses, which is a problem for them and which makes them less innovative, is that it's very hierarchical. So people don't feel comfortable taking decisions without approval from the higher ups. And there's this mentality of, to succeed in life, you really need to get to the top. So people are hyper competitive. Everyone wants to go to Seoul National University. And you have people who engage in fraud, and it turns out that those fraudsters are not more incompetent than those who went to Seoul National University. So it shows you how useful that university is as a metric to show you a good worker. And people fight to get to the top. Everyone has all these titles, and people don't really see themselves as equals in enterprises. There's a tendency for higher ups to be ruder to the lower ups, and then when people deal with sellers that they buy from, they're rude to those people. So you have this hierarchy where you put up with the abuse from your boss, and then you're mean to your employees or those who are so-called below you. Luckily, this is changing gradually in South Korea. An interesting thing about South Korea is that you have a lot of religious diversity. So you have Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, a bunch of Christian cults, shamanism. And South Korean Christianity is a bit different from other Christianity because they feel comfortable with going to shamans or other people to have predictions about the future or what they should do with their life, or am I gonna have bad luck or whatever. So one good thing about South Korea is religion doesn't matter really in marriage. A Korean Christian can marry a Buddhist without a problem. This is not Malaysia, where the Muslims only marry between each other. And then towards the end of the book, the author talks about the future for South Korea. So he talks about the Korean wave, which is South Korea becoming popular on the world stage through its movies like Old Boy, or through K-dramas, or through K-pop. This book talks a little bit about Big Bang. The author argues this is not really soft power, it's more just economic power and economic growth that this creates. And you also have some Korean cuisine popping up, but not that much literature yet. This is not really controlled by the Korean government. When Korean bureaucrats have tried to implicate themselves in this, it has not gone that well. So this rose mostly up spontaneously, and I can understand why, because I spend a lot of time watching Korean dramas and listening to Korean music, and the quality of both is very high. Korean movies and dramas are a lot about relationships instead of just a thrilling plot of solving a crime case. And the author acknowledges that South Korean demographics are not that great, with the birth rate being low, and I can see that the birth rate is getting a lot worse, because He gave the birth rate date in 2017, and then I know what the birth rate is now, and it's much lower. Just in 6 years it decreased a lot. But he believes that South Korea will continue to grow wealthier, and he also believes that South Korea and North Korea eventually will reunify, let's say in maybe 50 years, 40 years, but that this will be dependent on the North Korean government. South Korea just has to wait it out. It may be a gradual process, and South Korean government quietly favor a gradualist process. They don't want quick reunification because, you know, North Korea is extremely poor. So you could have gradual reunification. So we'll see. I agree that you could have something like that. Yeah, if you just look at the history, communist dictators are not sustainable. So it's inevitable that they will fall apart sometime. The Kim dynasty has been very good at keeping power in North Korea, but it cannot last. You have had dynasties that have lasted for hundreds of years, but if they stay dictatorial, they do not last. Eventually they fall apart. So we'll see. Yeah, I would say Korea will reunify, probably during my lifetime. So how would I rate The New Koreans by Michael Breen? I would give it a 10 out of 10. I love this book. Most of this book I read over just a few days. And this is a almost 400-page book, and it's very fascinating to me. And it's very well written. It's quite nuanced. There are a couple of delusional parts by the author at times, but that's rare. I have very little criticism to give of this book. And this guy has lived in South Korea for such a long time, so he knows the place quite well. It would be interesting to read other books on the topic of South Korea, so if you know books about South Korean history or culture, you can always recommend me. And it also makes me a bit more optimistic about South Korea, because if you look at the discourse about South Korea nowadays, it's very doom and gloom about how they're screwed because of their corporate system or their demographics or whatever, but things may turn out to be alright in the end. We'll see. I'm so happy that I got this book on South Korea, and I learned a lot about the country, and I intend to read more about this country because as a history student I have an interest in international relations, but I also have an interest in East Asia especially, and this book does have a nice reading list at the end to read more about the topic. So if you want to learn about South Korean history and culture, especially the post-World War II era, then I definitely recommend you to read The New Koreans by Michael Breen. By the way, it's written in relatively short chapters, so each chapter is about 10 to 20 pages, and it's not a heavy book to read. It does not use a bunch of fancy language that confuses you like some authors like to do. So check this book out. By the way, I'm a history student in the Netherlands, but I'm someone who really is fascinated by South Korea, and I love K-pop and K-dramas. I went to a ITZY concert in May. So anyone who knows more books where I can read up on this subject about South Korea specifically or Asia in general, or about South Korea's soft power, please let me know in the comments section below. And if you also appreciate South Korean popular culture like me, then comment below what your favorite Korean movie is, your favorite Korean TV show, your favorite Korean artists, K-pop groups, and your favorite K-pop songs. And if you want to learn more about Asian history and geopolitics, then you can check out my book review of The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd, which is about the Sino-American competition. Otherwise, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.